Thank you very much, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the program thus far. I know we all enjoyed the President of the United States and the luncheon with President Kwasniewski, President Uribe, and Governor Keane. Now we're going to go into a very interesting part of the program for you. This is meant to be a simulation of an emergency meeting of heads of state in the event of a terrorist attack. It's meant to give you an idea of what a meeting like this would be like and what the dialogue back and forth would be like. Fran Townsend, who will be chairing this meeting, has actually chaired these in real life and comes with tremendous experience, but also on the stage. We have Ambassador Paula Dobriansky, who will be serving as President of China. She's the former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs for President Bush, and she's currently at Harvard University. Following that is General Montgomery Meigs, who will be playing the role of the Secretary General of NATO, served in Vietnam and in Bosnia, and led the NATO stabilization forces in Bosnia. President Kwasniewski, Alexander Kwasniewski, who brought Poland into NATO and was an instrumental force towards an international response in Europe in the wake of 9/11. He'll be playing the President of Poland. Very familiar. We have Pascal de Muro, who will be playing the President of the United Nations Security Council. He's CEO of Giuliani Security now and spent 26 years with the FBI devoted to counterterrorism. Followed by, of course, Fran Townsend, who you already know from the session with President Bush. She'll be chairing the task force today. Ambassador John Negroponte will be representing the President of the United States. Dr. Sheridan G. Snyder will be playing the role of Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, and President Uribe of Colombia will be playing the President of Colombia. Ladies and gentlemen, enjoy the simulation. Fran?
I think we're going to start with a scene setter, so why don't I ask them to roll the video.
As viewers of this program know, 2 hours ago we started receiving reports of the bombing of the spring meeting of the Inter-American Development Bank in Bogota, Colombia. We're being told that this is yet another attack in a series of coordinated terrorist actions that have broken out on a global basis in the last several days. The death toll in this bombing has now reached over 50 and it's expected to rise. We're now receiving early reports of another attack, this one in Vienna, on a previously scheduled meeting of the OPEC member nations. This on day 3 of the 5-day Jihad of Retribution declared worldwide last Saturday by Al-Qaeda and its affiliates. Many experts had previously believed, given the death of Osama bin Laden and many of the leaders of the movement, that Al-Qaeda was no longer a serious threat as a terrorist organization. No one is thinking that now. Details are sketchy at this point as communications out of Vienna seem to have been disrupted as well. We have GNN staff in the city covering the OPEC conference, which was called prior to this week's wave of terror, and we will try to update the story as details become available. As we all know now, the jihad announced earlier this week was no idle threat and appears to have been in the planning stages for some time. To recap, the world was stunned Sunday evening when Google and social sites Facebook and Twitter were temporarily hijacked and users were directed to a web page declaring the holy war leading up to the anniversary of the death of Osama bin Laden at the hands of an elite American SEAL team on May 2nd, 1 year ago. The purveyors of the threats warned that there would be continuous attacks on the lives and comforts of all infidels worldwide in retribution for the killing of the founder and holy leader of Al-Qaeda. They added that they planned to disrupt the economy and livelihoods of those who oppress Muslims all over the world. Early Monday morning in Japan, coordinated attacks took place on the Nikkei exchange offices in Tokyo and on its affiliated offices of the Singapore Exchange and the Osaka Securities Exchange. The Chicago Mercantile Exchange in the US is also an arm of the Nikkei, but alerted by the Asian attacks, which occurred late Sunday night in Chicago, increased security on Monday morning thwarted an attempt on the Chicago Exchange, and the bomb was prevented from detonating by explosives technicians. The would-be bomber shot himself as police were surrounding the car, apparently unable to manually trigger an explosion. Yesterday, ports in Singapore, Gdansk in Poland and Long Beach, California were attacked by small teams of gunmen armed with automatic weapons and RPGs. Although security at all these ports has increased dramatically since 9/11, these enhanced security measures have been aimed at materials and personnel coming into the harbours from the sea, not invasions by land. 2 large tankers were damaged by rocket fire in Long Beach and are still ablaze. 1 massive supertanker was severely damaged in Gdansk and is on fire. Reports are still coming in, but currently the death toll stands at just over 85, most of whom were dock workers and ship's staff. Officials tell us that in addition to the normal human casualties sustained in this attack, that the environmental and financial damages that will result from the thousands of barrels and $1 billion worth of oil lost in the supertanker fire is potentially disastrous. At this hour, law enforcement has 7 of the terrorists in custody among the 3 locations. We are now joined by Jonathan Allred in Vienna by satellite phone. Jonathan, what can you tell us about today's attacks?
Janice Thompson, our producer, and I were just about to enter the conference hall after our breakfast in the plaza across the street when out of nowhere this small black SUV came towards the building at an excessively high speed, Simon. We stopped and watched in horror as the car sped past the security cordon and then it smashed into the front of the lobby of the building and detonated. We were knocked down by the blast and broken glass rubble poured all over us.
Jonathan, can you tell us more about the aftermath of the blast? Do you know how the ministers came to such harm from a blast on the ground floor?
Yes, Simon, the room in which the meeting was taking place is just above the lobby. Our understanding is that because the blast was so massive, it did substantial structural damage to the building and lifted the second story violently upwards. Simon, we've been asked to leave this area. Police are cordoning off the 10 blocks surrounding the OPEC building, and we're right in the middle of that area. We'll try to get another location and link up with you again.
Jonathan, if you can hear me, take care, my friend. Meanwhile, in Bogota, there are reports that a group is taking credit for these attacks that is seemingly not affiliated directly with Al-Qaeda, but who claims to share their goals, particularly, quote, disrupting the imperialist forces that are oppressing people all across the globe and in Latin America in particular. So there you have it. A week barely half over, and already the jihad of retribution has terrorized virtually every aspect of our lives. Political leaders and counter-terrorism officials across the globe are working feverishly, especially in Britain and the US, where there are a number of rumored threats to protect their populations and prevent widespread panic. Meanwhile, we're witnessing the birth of a new kind of globally coordinated terrorism. Terrorism that relies on large numbers of small, simultaneous attacks carried out by suicidal fighters willing to die for their cause. We all wonder what tomorrow and Friday could hold in store. This is Simon Marks in New York. Stay tuned for updates as they become available.
Okay, the most realistic part of this is you are going to have to deal with the public outcry for information. There's going to be multiple sources of conflicting information. It is not clear to whom you will be able to attribute and therefore take retribution for the attack. All of these represent real challenges for the entire international community. World leaders are dealing with their own populations who may be suffering as a result, not only economically but physically. There will be a huge demand for the sharing of information. In the video, we understand that at least three countries have 7 terrorists in custody, and so the question will become, what are they learning from these terrorists? What are they willing to share? When you hear information about targets, you understand that not only are they economic, but there are consistent themes. Stock exchanges are under attack, ports are under attack. These seem to be small groups of individuals that are operating together. Immediate questions arise about, are they crossing borders, are they communicating with one another, and how have they orchestrated this complete 5 days? What are we able to learn as a group from the taking over of the social networking sites, Google, Twitter, Facebook? Can we trace back, for attribution's sake, where this is coming from? These are the sorts of questions that will be happening oftentimes on a bilateral basis. Rarely will we all be sitting in the same room. We have the advantage of having a conversation this afternoon. And so I thought what I would do is, I'm going to start obviously with the former presidents, both of whom at this point early in the exercise have suffered attacks on their own soil. Let me start with President Kwasniewski. There's been an attack in your port. What are your concerns? What are your requirements in terms of support from the international community? And what are your priorities now?
Well, thanks God, that is only such simulation and not reality, but of course we should be prepared for such cases as well. I think for politicians, for the head of state in such situation, we have some very important elements, because the shock is obvious. We have dramatic pictures in TV. We have some kind of panic in this region and panic in the country as well, what's happened. So I think the real task for the leader is first to collect all information, to know what happened. Who did it, what can be the next steps of aggressor or terrorist or some. Second, of course, is this place, and to limit the number of victims, to protect the place. What I think in Polish case is possible to do, because Poland is quite a big country, of course, to some extent. We have 40 million people, but we have a lot of developed institutions prepared for that. I mean, military forces, police, anti-terrorist groups, etc., etc. Third is, of course, information, and when the president has necessary information, I think very important is to make the public statement and to fight against the panic, because the main problem in such situation is the panic, and especially now in this time we have open media, we have a lot of social network, and the information is going very fast. And if you will not manage the information from the very beginning, the space for panic is unbelievably huge. And that can create some additional problems. And last point is to start to speak with main partners what is going and how we will react. What are the main partners for Poland? Of course, United Nations, but that is a very complicated structure and it takes a lot of time, and I don't know how UN can react immediately for all these fears. NATO, and I think Poland as a member of NATO, having own part and contributed into NATO so much, can and having some units close to Polish border or even in Poland, can ask about reaction of NATO. European Union in sense of political support and economical support if necessary. Then neighbors, I think, because this attack is in Gdańsk, that's on the coast of Baltic Sea, we should immediately inform our closest neighbor, Germany from the west, and on the Baltic Sea, Lithuania, which is the next, Russia, Kaliningrad, that's a very, very sensitive question as well, and all Nordic countries, I mean Finland, Sweden, Denmark. Attack, of course, that's a simulation, but frankly speaking, such attack in Baltic Sea is extremely dangerous, because Baltic is a very closed sea. And if something like this example would happen, that's a tragedy for the sea, because frankly speaking, to reconstruct this environment, it looks almost impossible. That is not the ocean, that is not even Mexico Gulf, that is very, very close, not very big, and not very deep sea in the center of the continent. So that's his first reaction. Situation is dramatic, but we should fight against panic. We should organize all necessary measures in the region, and we should start to speak with our all partners in Europe and in the world.
Thank you, Mr. President. Let me go, before I go to NATO, I'm going to go to President Uribe. You have already, in Colombia, under the simulation, again, of course, we are pleased. We are pleased that it is not real, but what now are you thinking in terms of your own reaction? Both you have for Latin America, it is not just Colombia now, because you have partners who also have ports and who also have exchanges who will be seeking information from you. You may want to request assistance from your partners as well as the other victims around the world. You have dealt with many a crisis, and so President Uribe, we turn to you for your thoughts about what are your priorities and what are your concerns that you need to have addressed.
Thank you. In the simulation, we saw that the attack against Bogota was the third in a line. Therefore, with the two previous attacks targeted at economic activities, at business activities, in Colombia, because of the terrorism my country has suffered, my country has the time to make preemptive decisions. If there were two attacks against economic targets, business targets, and in Bogota we are having the summit of one very important multilateral bank, therefore we have to make decisions, prevention, second, reaction. There are ordinary reactions, common reactions, such as to attend the victims, to secure the place, to close borders, to ask for cooperation from the airlines, to offer rewards for those giving information, for us to arrest the perpetrators. Ordinary reaction, political reaction. It is very important for the government to take the strongest stand against terrorism. To say to the people, we cannot go back. In the middle of these difficulties, we have to persist. We have to persevere in our fight against terrorism. And it is very important to deliver a pedagogical speech, to explain that to the people what is the importance of the business community, what is the importance of the meetings, such as this meeting that was taking place in my city, that these institutions are key players for countries such as Colombia to overcome poverty and to have a better income distribution. We have to show, to express to the people that we cannot justify these terrorist attacks, that all the opposite. These terrorist attacks, instead of solving social problems, they create many more difficulties in the social fabric of the nation. We need to create a psychological mood against terrorism for people to overcome fear. I remember that in one similar attack, it was real. At the very beginning of the year 2003, 7 months after the inauguration of my first term, one bomb was blasted in one social club at the downtown of Bogota, El Nogal Club. And that night, in the middle of the ruins of the deaths, of the blood, I was said by many journalists Mr. President, we cannot win this battle. Please, you have to go back. And I explained to them why it was necessary to advance in this battle. Terrorism invades all the society. And we need to choose between democratic values or terrorism. And that morning, at that time of the sunrise, I said, my friends, instead of asking me to go back, please think in our people, in our future, and say this: Bogota cries, but never gives up. It is very important to lead the people for not to give up. In Latin America, we have one problem. With whom are we going to fight this battle? At this moment, we have no multilateral institutions to fight this battle. The Organization of American States is very weak in this regard. UNASUR has not declared the necessity to defeat terrorism. Brazil has created dangerous links with Iran. Venezuela, Bolivia. Therefore, it is necessary to think in multilateral institutions in the region. My colleague, the President of Poland, has said to us that it is very important to resort to OTAN, to NATO. In South America, at this moment, we have no supranational institutions to resort to. Therefore, it is necessary to create stronger alliances among many countries to fight terrorism.
Thank you, sir. Ambassador Negroponte, because of America's experience with 9/11, it is certain that the world will look to your leadership, and your colleagues around the world will seek your advice. You will have that burden, but you will also have security responsibilities here inside the United States to harden targets, to work with business. Talk us through how you would think about approaching this sort of a crisis, even though it hasn't started here. You've had the incident in Chicago you have to deal with. What are you thinking, and what are your priorities?
Right. Well, I think President Bush's conversation with you this morning was very instructive, because he had two very important messages, I thought, on the issue of leadership in the response to this kind of situation. Number one was, don't overreact. And I guess that's another way of saying we don't even really yet understand all the intricacies of what has happened. So we have to find that out. And and I'll come back to that in a moment. And the second is, of course, the point that both presidents have made, which is the importance of speaking out early to give a message of reassurance. And I would say, in relation to that, as a part of that also, and not overreacting, I think one has to be careful not to just lock down all economic activity because these economic targets have been struck. I think that would be giving the terrorists the victory that they want. There may be installations and infrastructure where we'll have to take additional precautions, or maybe even like the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, I guess we may have to temporarily recommend that it be closed down pending repairs or whatever. The point I would make on not overreacting is also the United States brings to the international community, I think, a public good that is sometimes underappreciated, and that is our enormous intelligence capability. And it seems to me that this is something that, in a variety of ways, we've got to help place at the disposal of both the affected countries and of the international community as a whole. And I'm sure there are going to be different ways of doing that, through bilateral liaison, through alliances, perhaps at some level through also some kind of information clearinghouse through the United Nations. But my main point is, we're the ones who have a lot of satellites in the air. We have a lot of intercept capability. we have, if you will, a global intelligence capacity, which we need now to find on an urgent basis a way of integrating with the ongoing efforts of all the other countries so that we can get a better appreciation of what in fact is happening. And my last point is, as I said, we don't know what's going on. This could be Al-Qaeda having spent 10 years figuring out how to get revenge, and for all I know, this is it. It's a last gasp, and there's no other capability behind that. But we need to get some sense of what kind of capabilities are behind the events that have just occurred.
Thank you, John. And you know what people need to appreciate, in order to turn that apparatus, that intelligence capability, to the common good of all who are now at risk, it requires information sharing. It's a machine that you don't just turn on, you must feed it requirements in order for it to be helpful. And so we understand that there are 7 terrorists in 3 of these locations in custody. It will require real-time, the willingness and the political will to share that information with the understanding that you're going to get something back from the U.S. capability. And so the question is, can we really do that? Let me turn to Ambassador Dobriansky. China, we've had the attack in Tokyo. You have exchanges, you have ports. There are a whole number of sort of domestic issues that you will want, security issues you'll want to address. But there is this information sharing need, let us call it, in order to be able to better target your efforts. Talk us through how you're going to approach the international community, one, to address your needs, and in answer to what will inevitably be requests for assistance throughout the Asian region.
Well, as the president of China, first, there are several issues that are uppermost in my mind. One is, I'll start with, the international community is always focusing on us, on our human rights situation. And I have to raise this because now, maybe because of these very tragic incidents, others will understand and appreciate what we're going through with regard to the Uyghurs in our country. We have the Uyghurs, there have been some acts of violence, and so first I'll start by saying that we want to, for ourselves, put this issue on the table so that others can understand and appreciate what we're grappling with domestically and why we have the kind of human rights constraints that we do in China. Secondly, I'd say that although we are very concerned about our access to ports and, of course, our own economic investments and interests, be it in Latin America, be it in Europe, that nevertheless, we're also very focused on our resources and the resources that we have to devote ourselves to our own situation. So I need to find out more information about whether or not we really have a role here. Thirdly, President Kwasniewski, I believe, mentioned the United Nations. We have always looked at the importance. Well, we, China, have always looked to the United Nations for a discussion, an international discussion. We think that that forum, and then we sit on the Security Council, and we think that that's a vehicle in which to address this. And finally, you asked me about, the communication. Well, our view is, we can handle our own affairs very efficiently and effectively. We will step forward, but we will handle our own national affairs. We're a sovereign country. We want to help, and we have been, by the way, helping in a number of humanitarian and very tragic circumstances by giving some resources. But let me just say that we have our own national boundaries and sovereignty issues, so we'll look at it in that context, and we look forward to hearing more.
Mr. Snyder, you're the Prime Minister of the UK. You have many ports, you have an exchange, and so you are vulnerable to these types of attacks. You understand and have had a history through your intelligence services combating Al-Qaeda and terrorism, as well before that. How do you, with the attack in Vienna and 6 of the OPEC ministers confirmed dead, oil prices are skyrocketing, there will be a lot of chaos throughout Europe. What are your concerns, and how do you believe Europe will look to you for your leadership?
Well, first of all, in Europe, we're going to have a coordinated effort. We can't have 4 or 5 or 6 individual efforts. Secondly, extremism and terrorism is a new form of combat. It's very new. We don't understand it well. We understood what happened in World War II when borders were violated, tanks and bazookas were flaming. That's a very obvious form of attack and war. But now we have an invisible war. And so with my partners in Europe, I would hope they would have the same type of communication centers that we have. We have a central unit for communications here in the United Kingdom. And then we have another center of direction, which is a response team. And then we have a team that's going to look after handling our own people and making sure there's calm and they get the proper information. So we have 3 separate units to respond. But from the standpoint of response, it's a very tricky element for us because very quickly you have to decide how serious this attack is. Do you wait for one tanker and section of storage of oil to go up in flames, or is that not really enough? Should you wait for 3 or 4? And so what is the time and position of response relative to the attack? As we have heard President Bush remind us, don't overreact. Make sure you have the information first. But I might also say that I had the pleasure of attending a Concordia conference recently and learned that the former commissioner of the 9/11 Commission told us that the weaknesses that we saw in the 9/11 attack have not been addressed by the United States very well, down to the point that the various police departments and fire departments don't even have the same radios, so they can't have radio contact with each other. And so this new form of silent war, if we were attacked on our borders with tanks and guns, we would have had a full tank, it's well defined. Well, why haven't we responded to the weaknesses of the United States that we look to for the leadership? Because not only are they a very strong partner for us in freedom, but they also had the experience of a 9/11 attack. And how much have we learned from that attack, and what was the response, and what should have been the response? Now, here in the United Kingdom, we have learned something from that, but we feel once 9/11 has passed, that the idea that the whole issue has passed. It's not like an ongoing conflict and war. So this idea of a new form of invisible combat, we're trying to respond to it, but we've got to get our partners in Europe and the United States to work with us.
Thank you. General Meigs, you heard the Polish president say he was going to look to NATO. Will this be considered, you've had the attack both in Poland and in Vienna. Is an attack on one an attack on the alliance? Right, and so how will NATO respond, and how quickly will it be able to respond to the demands that you're already hearing build?
Well, the first thing that would happen is there'd be an immediate meeting of the NATO Military Committee to try to ascertain exactly what's happened, and there would be some sharing of intelligence information there, though it's generally not at the most heavily classified levels. And there's a certain amount of bilateral exchanges going along with information between countries that trust each other to keep that secret. But as you all have said, the critical thing at this point is information. And when a consensus began to form amongst a critical mass of NATO countries about forming a combined joint task force to go accomplish some sort of military task, and by that I mean the kinds of military tasks you would expect special operations forces to do, it's very possible that after a meeting or two of the North Atlantic Council, which are the civilian representatives of nations who monitor and vote on what NATO is going to do, you could form a combined joint task force that was focused on this kind of a problem, because we've done that in Iraq and Afghanistan. And there are capabilities in many of the nations that could lend themselves to that if the nation thought that that was in its interest, as opposed to using that capability for their own purposes. And you could have a force that went out of area, because we've done that. We've established the precedent for that. So if you discovered where the core of this network of unconventional warfare was coming from, it's very conceivable that NATO could be asked to go deal with that problem, or to assist other nations in dealing with that problem. It wouldn't take too long to put a force together if there was a very strong consensus among NATO members that that had to be done, and that in capitals they also wanted to do that. So the way the process works, the North Atlantic Council says, we think we ought to do this, and remember, it only takes one vote to say no to kill it. Then the NATO Military Committee would start a process of what's called flags to post, going around asking nations what they can contribute, taking that and forming a combined joint task force. And usually the big debates are about who's the commander and the operations officer, and the subordinate intermediate commanders. And you could actually do that fairly quickly. And given it takes so long for us to understand what the real problem is here, that's probably not a bad thing.
General, you started by making the point that it requires information, though, to target that task force. And NATO does not have its own intelligence collection capability, and so you rely on your member states, right? Exactly. And you would have to sort of set requirements, if you will. That is, say what's the types of information you would need to respond adequately, and you would put that request out to the members of the alliance. How quickly does that get answered? You made the point there are restrictions on the information sharing within the alliance, and we have struggled, we know, in Iraq and Afghanistan with what we call REL NATO, releasable to NATO forces, which is a less detailed, let us say. Can you describe for folks who are less familiar the challenges of that and getting that information, because of course the Polish president sitting next to you is waiting for help?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and I'll try to deal with it quickly, but it has a couple layers to it. And I'll use the force I commanded in Bosnia as an example, because that's how it would be put together. So at the formal NATO level, you would have an intelligence detachment in each of the contingents that would report to a combined intelligence shop that was working in the combined joint task force. Now, some nations, like the United States and Great Britain, will only share some of their most sensitive information with a small group of nations that they've been doing with that forever. Well, not forever, since World War II. So you get United States, New Zealand, Great Britain, Australia, and Canada. And that's a fairly free-flowing exchange of intelligence. The extent to which the joint the Combined Joint Task Force commander can establish trust with his other national commanders, and that is the commanders of the national commander is an officer who's put in the headquarters who represents the force from a given nation. He's not the commander of that force. And he's put in the Combined Joint Task Force for two reasons. One, he's the one that says no to the combined commander if there's a national caveat to doing what the national commander wants. But he is also the person who will come to the national commander or his deputy and say, General, I have something that I can share only with you. And as ComS4, some of the best intelligence I got was given to me informally by national commanders. Now, there's some nations that have very good intelligence operations, there's others that don't. This would be more of a trial in a counter-terrorist situation because of the ephemeral, sensitive nature of the intelligence, and nations aren't real happy to give it away, whereas in a peacekeeping operation, it's fairly easy. But using the pursuit of persons indicted for war crimes as an example, when a nation from our formation was working a PIFWIC problem, no matter what nation it was, I had a very good picture of that. So, what does it depend on? It depends on trust nation to nation. It depends on trust combined force commander to national commander. And it depends on the degree to which the nation wants to do that back in its capital. And you have two presidents here that can tell you how that works.
Now, to the UN. Pat, there has been a suggestion by the Polish president, which I would agree with. I am somewhat skeptical of the ability for even the Security Council to act quickly, or to be, as was suggested by the UK, potentially a clearinghouse of information. You've had tremendous experience working international terrorism cases. Talk to us about how you would work through that and what your experience has been in terms of the utility of the UN in such a circumstance.
Well, I think we know from what we saw in the video that we're midway through a week of terror, and that there are very, very much potential that there's going to be additional attacks underway. So in looking at this type of situation, the first thing you want to do is separate this into both consequence and crisis management. So you'd want to look at the consequence management side and say what intelligence can be put together very quickly, knowing that usually the intelligence you first receive may not be very accurate. So there has to be a vetting process in that intelligence, and try to act in a position gathering that intelligence from countries and sharing that intelligence with the countries that need it. We've seen the countries that have been attacked. There's several individuals that have been captured, trying to obtain information from them immediately to try to put information out through the UN that will help other countries identify if there's a potential attack in their country to their citizens and prevent further loss of life. You're also going to see a longer term here with the attacks that have been taken. These are very common areas that have been focused on by Al-Qaeda before. Transportation nodes, the financial sector, the energy sector affects the transportation, ports. You're going to see very quickly commodities that are very essential to human life in short supply. Where can the UN come in to help to make sure there are plans and considerations for all countries to be able to share in that, and making sure that energy gets to the countries that it needs to. Different products are there for the citizens. And then thirdly, I think the United Nations would play a very important and key role, that any strategic response would be based upon vetted intelligence and working with those countries to make sure that those responsible for these terrorist attacks are held responsible and brought to justice.
In this first round, you've heard again and again the importance of information sharing and in real time, and it really requires two things, both the capability, that is to collect it and to share it, but even with that, that won't happen unless there are trust between the partners. building that trust cannot happen in the midst of a crisis. It can, but it tends not to work very efficiently or very well. And so, of course, building these trusted partnerships in peacetime when you can is really very important. The second thing you heard is that information sharing happens most frequently and most fulsomely on a bilateral level, point to point between two countries. Is it possible for it to happen at a multilateral level? You heard General Meigs talk about NATO. Yes, but it tends to be less detailed and less sensitive. And in a crisis, what you really need is the greatest level of detail you can get. And you heard President Uribe. In Latin America, there isn't that sort of multilateral structure that he could fall back on and rely on. I'd like to go back to the two presidents for a moment, though, and talk for a minute. The targets here are economic. There is this nexus when you talk about ports or the exchanges. Both are highly regulated and are the government is highly involved, but tend to be operated and owned, the infrastructure, by the private sector. And so the ability of the government to work with the private sector to address the crisis is going to be very, very important. I'll start, why don't I start this time with President Uribe. Talk for a moment about the relationship between the government and the private sector to work together in a crisis. Does that structure exist now? And what do you think is most important to establishing a good relationship between the government and the private sector to be able to work together in such a crisis?
My experience in Colombia indicates that it is impossible for the government to win this battle without the effective participation of the private sector. Thinking in the case of the simulation, and thinking in the frame for prevention, it is very important to have technological intelligence provided by the private sector in countries such as Colombia. My experience indicates that our governments in many countries of Latin America do not have the money to buy the last arrival of technology, the state-of-the-art technology. And when we have tried to buy this technology, we have been short. And at the moment we begin operating this technology, we fail. Therefore, one way we need is to joint action with the private sector, for the private sector to provide this technology and to operate this technology, and of course, to send all the information to the government, for the government to act on the right time. You spoke about how to build confidence, trust among countries. I am very concerned because in our neighborhood there are countries dismissing the risk, the danger of terrorism. Therefore, we need a stronger alliance in the international community to exercise pressure on those countries for them to line up in the fight against terrorism. What can we do if President Chavez of Venezuela does not fight terrorist groups? What is the remedy? It is necessary a very strong international alliance to say to him, to fight terrorism is a universal duty. You have to fight terrorism. Only with diplomatic relationships, with the weakness of many institutions, in the case of Latin American countries, the Organization of American States, it is not effective to align these kind of countries with this fight. The world needs to think in other decisions to exercise pressure on these countries for them to intervene in the fight against terrorism.
Thank you. President Kuzniewski, talk to us about the relationship between the government and the private sector and the ability, and in answer to President Uribe's question, the ability to marshal sort of the moral authority and the political will to put pressure on those who are less cooperative or less willing to participate?
No doubts. I can repeat what I said during the lunch. In such fight, we need the widest possible solidarity. And in this, if we speak about solidarity, this mutual understanding and common work of the government and business society is necessary. Because especially in the moment of attack, because it's important to create the atmosphere of common responsibility, common understanding, and common fight against terrorism, and especially this cooperation between government and private sector is extremely important in the time of reconstruction. Because after all these dramas, we have destroyed ports, harbors, buildings, cities, etc., etc. So I think that is extremely important element. Why this international solidarity and this solidarity between public sector and private sector is important? Because, of course, we speak about hypothetical situation, but this situation shows how it's dramatic. First of all, we speak here. We need information, we need good intelligence. But frankly speaking, this attack means that we have very weak intelligence because we have attacks. If we would have a very good, strong intelligence, this situation still would be hypothetical, but it's happened. So the first, we all leaders of the country or of the states, we know that our intelligence is weak. And of course, what is not my advice to next presidents, the wrongest decision is to dismiss the chief of intelligence immediately because he didn't inform us about this danger. This creates new problems and is not very useful. But frankly speaking, it shows that we are in troubles. The intelligence didn't inform us that some fears are so realistic. First, in Polish case, and that is a big difference between, of course this is better for us, but frankly speaking, such dramatic situation, Colombia and Colombian public opinion is much better prepared for terrorist attack as Polish, because in Poland it's never happened. This is first time in the history. We spoke about terrorism, we fought against terrorism, we participated in some alliance against terrorism, but never, terrorist attack never happened on Polish soil. And first time we have, so that can create a lot of panic, uncontrolled reaction and so on. So then we should propose as a leaders two things. First, we have the real allies abroad, and we are speaking with all these allies, and we can count on NATO, on European Union, United States, United Nations, so on, because this element of international solidarity can be decisive to stop this atmosphere of panic. And second, domestically, we need the closest as possible cooperation between public sector and private sector, the people, all these institutes and elements of the community and the state, because in such a dramatic situation, first of all, is not to create a new problem, so new dramas. It's necessary to limit all this how to say damages which are so dramatic in this case. So that's is no doubt. We need solidarity on various levels, and this understanding and cooperation between private and public sector is absolutely one of the main conditions for how to overcome this situation.
As we wrap up this first round before we go to the breakout sessions, I think it's worth, both presidents have made the point about the importance of an exchange of information between the government and the private sector. I know during my time in government we made this a priority. We made some strides. I know the new administration is working on the public-private partnership. But as we face around the world a fiscal crisis, now is the time, it is more important than ever that we understand what the capabilities are that reside both inside government and in the private sector. And to President Uribe's point, that there is an ongoing dialogue about how to share that information sort of legally, effectively, so that we can protect our own populations and we can share that information. And during a budget crisis, all countries are going to have to face this notion of where do we cut our budgets. And we will face a very certain risk that as we consider these budget cuts from military, law enforcement, intelligence, when you cut, you also cut capability. It is not just you're cutting a budget, but you're cutting a capability. This happened post the Cold War, and countries around the world paid a price, particularly the United States on 9/11. And so I would close this session by telling people, as you go into these breakout sessions and talk about this, the importance of leveraging existing capabilities before you think about cutting domestic capability in each of these countries is incredibly important. I want to thank President Kozgiewski and President Uribe, as well as my fellow panelists. Thank you. I think this was a really terrific discussion to start the breakout sessions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hello? Hello? Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us in that unique and what we hope was very entertaining session with all the leaders here. We certainly enjoyed it. We have one more favor to ask of you, and to thank you very much for participating. And now's the time when you get to have your say as the audience. And so we'd be very appreciative if you'd be willing to stay with us and sort of take what you've learned from this simulation and put it into use in the various breakout sessions. I think you could find your assignment on the back of your credentials, and if not, just ask any of our staff. But I think this is the last time we'll gather as a group, so sincere thanks on behalf of Matt and I for coming, and the inaugural Concordia Summit will hopefully be the first of many. Thank you.
Thank you.